The year is 1963. New York City is a city of two worlds, separated by more than just geography. To the south, the glass towers of Midtown pulse with the cold, sterile rhythm of corporate greed and old money arrogance. To the north, across the invisible border of 110th Street, lies Harlem, a vibrant, soulful kingdom where the air smells of roasted coffee, expensive cigars, and the simmering heat of the civil rights movement. In this era, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson is no longer the young lion who fought Dutch Schultz. He is the lion in winter, a refined, silver-haired sovereign who moves through the streets in a black 1963 Cadillac Fleetwood. He is the Godfather of Harlem, a man who reads Machiavelli in his silk pajamas and discusses the future of the neighborhood with civil rights leaders. His power is absolute because it is quiet. He doesn't need to shout. A slight nod of his head can move millions of dollars or silence a city block. On a crisp October morning, Bumpy stands in front of his mirror, adjusting a charcoal grey suit. His wife, Mayme Johnson, the woman who has stood by him through prison stints and gang wars, is preparing for a trip to the Upper East Side. She is accompanied by their daughter, Ruthie. They are dressed in their Sunday best, pearls, pillbox hats and gloves, looking every bit like the royalty they are. Bumpy kisses Mayme's cheek, his eyes softening. In a world that often treats them as second-class citizens, Mayme is his North Star. He watches them leave, unaware that within 3 hours, the peace he has maintained for decades is about to be shattered by the ego of a man who thinks his bank account makes him invincible. The setting is Sterling's, the most exclusive boutique on Fifth Avenue, a cathedral of high fashion where the carpet is so thick it swallows the sound of footsteps. It is a place where whites only isn't written on a sign, but is felt in every cold stare. Mayme and Ruthie enter, seeking a dress for a gala. They move with grace, their dignity a natural armor. The antagonist, Julian Sterling, a real estate mogul whose family has owned half of Manhattan since the Dutch arrived, is in the shop with his mistress. Sterling is the archetype of mid-century arrogance, tan, loud, and convinced that the world is his personal plaything. When he sees Mayme and Ruthie browsing the silk gowns, something ugly flares in his eyes. It isn't just racism. It is the indignation of a man who believes those people shouldn't even breathe the same expensive air as he does. The confrontation is swift and brutal in its coldness. Sterling doesn't use physical force. He uses words. He walks over, his voice a polished blade, and insults them with a level of vitriol that silences the entire store. He calls Mayme a glorified servant and tells the manager to disinfect the racks once they leave. When Ruthie tries to speak, he shuts her down with a slur that cuts deeper than any knife. He makes sure they are humiliated in front of the wealthy elite of New York, laughing as the security guard escorts them to the sidewalk. Mayme doesn't scream. She doesn't cry. She stands on the sidewalk of Fifth Avenue, her head held high, but her hand is trembling. When they return to Harlem, the air in the Johnson apartment changes. Bumpy is sitting in his study, a glass of 12-year-old scotch in his hand. He looks at Mayme's face, the subtle redness in her eyes, the tightness in her jaw. And he knows. He doesn't reach for his gun. He doesn't call his enforcers to go and shoot up Sterling's penthouse. Instead, he places a gentle hand on Mayme's shoulder and says, "Go rest, Mayme." He thinks his money protects him. He thinks his status is a shield. I'm going to show him that in 72 hours his money will be paper and his status will be a curse. Bumpy looks at his watch. The clock has started. Julian Sterling has just sparked a war he doesn't even know exists yet. High above the bustling noise of Manhattan, in a corner office that occupied the 44th floor of the Sterling building on Park Avenue, Julian Sterling sat ensconced in a throne of polished mahogany and tufted Italian leather. To Sterling, the world was a series of assets to be acquired and liabilities to be liquidated. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass, Central Park looked like a toy garden, and the people below were merely ants scurrying between his many properties. In 1963, Julian Sterling was not just a man, he was an institution. He sat on the boards of 3 major banks, held the mortgages of half of the luxury apartments on the Upper East Side, and shared monthly dinners with the police commissioner and the mayor. The office was a temple to mid-century modern excess. Original Rothkos adorned the walls, and the air was filtered through a state-of-the-art ventilation system that removed the city's grime, leaving only the faint, expensive scent of lemon polish and imported gin. Sterling poured himself a drink, the ice clinking against the crystal with a sound that signaled comfort and absolute security. He hadn't thought about the incident at the boutique for more than 5 minutes. To him, insulting those women wasn't a crime or even a mistake. It was a corrective measure. He viewed his outburst at Sterling's on Fifth as a king reclaiming his territory from intruders who didn't know their place. A man from Harlem? Sterling had scoffed earlier that afternoon when his nervous assistant mentioned a rumor that the women were related to someone influential north of 110th Street. Sterling had laughed, a dry, hollow sound. In Harlem, influence means you own a few bars and a fleet of taxis. Down here, influence means you own the air those people breathe. Let him stay in his ghetto. He can't touch a dime of my fortune, and he certainly can't walk through these doors without a warrant or a mop. Sterling's arrogance was his armor. He believed that the intricate web of legal protections, social status, and immense wealth made him a ghost, an untouchable figure in the eyes of a man like Bumpy Johnson. He lived in a world of contracts, escrow accounts, and political favors. He assumed Bumpy lived in a world of switchblades and street corners. Julian Sterling failed to realize that power, in its purest form, doesn't care about zip codes. He didn't understand that while he owned the buildings, Bumpy Johnson owned the heartbeat of the people who kept those buildings running. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows over his Park Avenue empire, Sterling felt invincible. He was at the peak of his power, unaware that the foundation of his tower was already being systematically dismantled by a man who moved in the silences he had never bothered to listen to. While Julian Sterling sipped gin in his ivory tower 4 miles north, the atmosphere in the back room of the 22 West Club was as heavy as a funeral shroud. The club was a temple of Harlem's elite, jazz musicians, intellectuals, and the silent architects of the street. But tonight, the music was low, and the doors were locked to the public. Bumpy Johnson sat behind a desk of dark oak, his silver hair catching the dim light of a single banker's lamp. He was not a man of chaos, he was a man of order, and the insult to Mayme had been a violation of the highest order. In front of him stood no gunman, no muscle, and no street thugs. Instead, Bumpy had summoned his council of information. There was Elias, a head waiter at the Metropolitan Club where Sterling dined, Sarah, a senior switchboard operator at the New York Telephone Company, and Arthur, a meticulous accountant who worked in the basement of the very bank that held Sterling's corporate debt. Bumpy looked at them, his eyes like 2 pieces of polished flint. He wasn't looking for blood. He was looking for the threads that held Sterling's life together. Julian Sterling thinks we are invisible, Bumpy said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that commanded total silence. He thinks the people who park his cars, connect his calls, and clean his floors are part of the furniture. We are going to show him that the furniture has ears, and the walls have memories. I don't want him dead. Death is an escape. I want him to watch his world vanish, piece by piece, until he realizes that the only thing he has left is the shame he tried to give my wife. Bumpy began to issue his commands with the precision of a master clockmaker. Sarah was tasked with intercepting Sterling's private calls to his mistress and his offshore brokers. Elias would listen for the whispered secrets of Sterling's business rivals at the club. Arthur was given a specific mission: find the black ink in Sterling's ledgers, the hidden loans and the precarious tax shelters that kept the mogul afloat. Bumpy understood a truth that Sterling never would. Status is a collective illusion. If the people who serve you decide to stop believing in that illusion, you cease to exist. As the meeting adjourned, Bumpy remained alone in the room, the smoke from his cigar curling toward the ceiling. He pulled out a small pocket watch, the same silver one he had used decades ago. He clicked it open. The first hour of the 72 had passed. He wasn't just planning a strike. He was orchestrating a symphony of ruin. Sterling had relied on the height of his tower to protect him, but Bumpy knew that the higher the tower, the more devastating the fall. By tomorrow morning, the first cracks would appear in the foundation of Julian Sterling's life, and the man in the Park Avenue penthouse would have no idea that the ghosts of Harlem were already inside his home. The first 24 hours of Julian Sterling's hell did not begin with a bang, but with a series of tiny, maddening inconveniences. Sterling woke up at 7 a.m. in his penthouse, expecting the seamless luxury he had enjoyed for decades. However, the world felt slightly off. His morning coffee was cold, the maid claiming the stove had malfunctioned. His favorite silk tie was missing, and the newspaper, usually placed precisely on his breakfast tray, was nowhere to be found. When he stepped out to his private elevator, his chauffeur, a man who had been in his service for 5 years, was not there. Instead, a stranger stood by a plain black sedan. "Frank is ill today, Mr. Sterling," the man said, his eyes hidden behind dark aviators. "I'm your substitute." Sterling, annoyed but running late for a crucial board meeting, grunted and climbed into the back. He didn't notice that the driver wasn't taking the usual route down Park Avenue. Instead, they were diverted into heavy traffic, the driver accidentally missing 3 green lights. Inside the car, Sterling tried to use his mobile car phone, a rare luxury in 1963, to call his office. All he heard was a high-pitched whine and the faint, rhythmic clicking of a switchboard operator at work. When he finally arrived at his office, 45 minutes late, his secretary looked like she had seen a ghost. "Mr. Sterling, your 9 a.m. with the Chase Manhattan auditors. They cancelled," she whispered. "Cancelled? On what grounds?" Sterling roared. "They didn't say, sir, only that there was a re-evaluation of risk based on a leaked internal memo." Sterling stormed into his office, slamming the door. He didn't know that the memo was a carefully forged document planted in the bank's mailroom by a janitor who happened to be Bumpy Johnson's cousin. He didn't know that every glitch in his morning was a calculated move to raise his blood pressure and fracture his sense of order. The fortress of his life was built on the labor of people he considered beneath him, and those people were now slowly withdrawing their support, leaving the foundation to groan under the weight of his own ego. By lunchtime, the psychological pressure shifted from his private life to his social sanctuary, the Metropolitan Club. This was where the real power of New York resided, over dry martinis and rare steaks. Sterling arrived, desperate to smooth over the clerical error with the bank auditors. He spotted Arthur Van Pelt, the bank's chairman, sitting in their usual corner booth. But as Sterling approached, Van Pelt didn't stand. He didn't even look up. He continued cutting his steak as if Sterling were a ghost. When Sterling reached the table, Van Pelt's bodyguard stepped forward, a move that was unheard of between friends. "Julian," Van Pelt said, his voice as cold as the ice in his glass, "I received a very interesting recording this morning. It seems you've been speaking quite disparagingly about our upcoming merger in, let's say, intimate settings, and that incident at the boutique yesterday. The commissioner's wife was 3 racks away. She found your language unbecoming of a member of this club." Sterling felt the air leave his lungs. "Arthur, that's nonsense. It was a minor disagreement with some—" With the family of a man you shouldn't have crossed, Van Pelt interrupted, finally looking up. His eyes were filled with a strange kind of pity. You're a liability now, Julian. The board is calling back the short-term loans on the Park Avenue project. You have 48 hours to cover the $20 million gap, or we begin foreclosure. Sterling stood frozen in the middle of the dining room. He could feel the eyes of every titan of industry on him. The whispers started, hushed, jagged sounds that felt like physical blows. As he turned to leave, a waiter tripped, spilling a tureen of lobster bisque directly onto Sterling's bespoke suit. "Oh, terribly sorry, sir," the waiter said, his face a mask of feigned incompetence. But as Sterling looked into the waiter's eyes, he saw a spark of recognition. It was the same look of quiet, burning dignity he had seen in Mayme Johnson's eyes the day before. He rushed out of the club, his heart hammering against his ribs. He called his mistress's apartment from a payphone, desperate for a kind word. A man answered, a man with a deep, calm Harlem accent. "She's not here, Mr. Sterling. She's busy explaining those photos we sent to her husband. You have 48 hours left. Bumpy says, hello." The first 24 hours were over. Julian Sterling, the man who owned the air, was starting to realize he was suffocating. The second day of Julian Sterling's descent into a living nightmare did not announce itself with the violent crash of a gunshot, but with the rhythmic, mechanical, and utterly relentless clicking of a ticker-tape machine. It was a sound that usually brought Sterling comfort, the sound of numbers climbing, of wealth generating wealth, but this morning the noise felt like a hammer driving nails into a coffin. At precisely 8 a.m., Sterling arrived at his Park Avenue headquarters, his gait uneven and his eyes a map of red veins. He had spent the night pacing his penthouse, the silence of his home punctuated only by the haunting memory of that calm Harlem voice on the telephone. He needed to move. He needed to fight. He reached for his private ivory telephone line, the direct link to his offshore brokers in the Cayman Islands. He needed to liquidate $20 million in blue-chip stocks immediately to cover the aggressive margin calls that Chase Manhattan had suddenly leveled against him. When he pressed the receiver to his ear, his heart skipped a beat. There was no dial tone. Instead, there was a faint, rhythmic breathing, followed by a calm, female voice. One of the thousands of invisible switchboard operators Bumpy Johnson had shielded and supported in the tenements of Harlem for decades. "I am terribly sorry, Mr. Sterling," she said, her tone professional but chillingly empty. "All outgoing lines to international exchanges and private banking nodes are currently experiencing technical difficulties. We expect the disruption to last at least 48 hours. Please, stay on the line if you wish to hear a recording of our service terms." Sterling slammed the heavy receiver down so hard it cracked the mahogany cradle. A cold, oily sweat broke out across his forehead, drenching his silk collar. He didn't have 48 hours. He had minutes before the financial markets opened, and his reputation was shredded on the trading floor. Suddenly, his office door, a solid slab of oak meant to keep the world out, swung open without a knock. 4 men marched in, their faces as expressionless as granite. They wore identical charcoal suits and flashed gold badges that glinted with a predatory light in the morning sun. They weren't local police. They were the Men in Black from the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. "Mr. Julian Sterling?" the lead agent asked, his voice as dry and sharp as a paper cut. He didn't wait for an answer. "We have received a comprehensive 300-page dossier regarding your Project Olympus real estate holdings and your shell corporations in the Antilles. It seems there are significant, perhaps criminal, discrepancies between your reported tax filings and your actual debt-to-equity ratios. We have a federal injunction signed 2 hours ago to freeze every liquid asset, every trust fund, and every petty cash drawer associated with your primary accounts. This is a 72-hour emergency audit. Sterling felt the air leave his lungs, his vision blurring at the edges. A dossier? From whom? This is a political hit job. I've hosted fundraisers for the men who run your departments. The agent looked at him with a flicker of genuine pity. The kind one shows a dying animal. Your friends are the ones who authorized this raid, Mr. Sterling. They don't like being associated with a man whose private black ledgers have been leaked to the New York Times. It seems an anonymous whistleblower provided us with the exact location of your floor safe in your summer home in the Hamptons, along with the combination. Sterling's legs gave out, and he slumped into his leather chair. Only 3 people in the world knew about that safe: himself, his mistress, and the master locksmith who had installed it 10 years ago. He had forgotten that the locksmith was a man from Harlem whose son's medical school tuition had been quietly, anonymously paid for by a community scholarship fund controlled by Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy hadn't used a crowbar. He had used the long-term loyalty of the working class. As the agents began systematically stretching bright yellow seized tape across his filing cabinets and his safe, Sterling watched his life's work vanish behind a wall of federal red tape. He was still a billionaire on paper, but as the agents confiscated his checkbooks and credit cards, he realized with a jolt of terror that he didn't even have enough cash in his pocket to buy a pack of cigarettes. The paper war was over, and Julian Sterling had been utterly disarmed without a single drop of blood being spilled. By 11 a.m., the psychological claustrophobia of the paper war shifted from Julian Sterling's bank accounts to the very air he breathed. Sterling stood in the center of his opulent lobby, screaming for his building manager, but his voice only echoed off the cold Carranza marble. The silence was absolute. In the 1960s, a skyscraper was a living, breathing organism that required thousands of invisible hands to function, hands that Sterling had never bothered to acknowledge. At a single, whispered word from Bumpy Johnson, the heart of the Sterling building had simply stopped beating. It wasn't a loud, picketing strike with signs and shouting. It was something far more terrifying. A total, silent disappearance. The elevator operators, the men who manually maneuvered the brass levers to ferry the elite of New York to their sky-high offices, had stepped out of their cabs and walked into the sunlight of Park Avenue. The janitorial staff had laid down their mops. The engineers had turned the dials on the boiler systems to standby and vanished. Sterling looked at the bronze indicator above the elevator bank. Every single car was stuck on the ground floor, their doors yawning open like empty mouths. He was on the 44th floor of his own empire, and he was effectively a prisoner. He attempted to storm down the emergency stairs, but by the time he reached the 20th floor, his lungs were burning, and the bespoke Italian leather of his shoes was pinching his feet. He realized, with a surge of nauseating irony, that Bumpy Johnson had turned his own monument to success into a vertical torture chamber. The sabotage extended beyond the walls of his office. At the Sterling Grand Hotel, the kitchen staff, primarily black men and women who had lived in Harlem under Bumpy's protection for generations, simply ceased cooking. High-ranking diplomats and oil tycoons sat in the gold-leaf dining room, waiting for lobster thermidor that would never arrive. When Sterling finally reached his penthouse, gasping for air and drenched in sweat, he found his front door propped open. His domestic staff was gone. The silver was untouched. The Rothkos were still on the walls, but the trash bins had been emptied onto his white shag carpet. Bumpy Johnson had often said that a man like Sterling didn't know how to boil an egg or tie his own laces without help. Now, Sterling was proving him right. He stood in his kitchen, staring at a stove he didn't know how to operate, surrounded by the stench of the city's uncollected garbage that was already beginning to pile up at his service entrance. He was a king without a single subject left to command. In the 1960s, power was often measured by who you could force to serve you. Bumpy had just reminded Sterling that service is a gift of the worker, not a right of the master. As Sterling sat in the dark, the building's fuse box having accidentally blown, he heard the distant rhythmic sound of drums from a street fair in Harlem, miles away, but echoing through the canyons of Manhattan. It was the sound of a community that was whole, vibrant and united, mocking the hollow, silent shell of his life. He was a billionaire in a tomb of glass and steel, and the 72 hours were only halfway through. By 3 p.m. on the second day, Julian Sterling was no longer a man. He was a frantic animal pacing the cage of his own making. The silent strike had left him physically isolated, but it was the sudden, inexplicable shift in the financial winds of New York that truly began to break his spirit. In the high-stakes world of 1960s real estate, Sterling's empire was a house of cards held together by a complex web of leveraged debt and short-term promissory notes. He functioned on the assumption that as long as his name carried weight, his credit was infinite. Bumpy Johnson, however, understood the physics of ruin better than any Harvard-educated economist. He knew that when a man of Sterling's stature becomes a social and political pariah, his debt becomes a toxic asset. Sitting in the dim light of a Harlem social club, Bumpy placed a call to a very specific set of associates in East Harlem, the leadership of the Genovese crime family. In the underworld, Bumpy was a man of his word, and the Italians respected the grand old man of Harlem. "Sterling is falling," Bumpy told them, his voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "His banks are panicking. They want off his sinking ship, buy his private notes, buy his mortgages on the Fifth Avenue properties at 40 cents on the dollar. Then sell them to me." The Italians, recognizing a golden opportunity to profit while also paying a debt of respect to Bumpy, moved with lethal efficiency. By late afternoon, Sterling's lead attorney, a man named Henderson, who looked as though he had aged a decade in 8 hours, burst into the Park Avenue penthouse. He didn't even bother to take off his coat. "Julian, it's over. The bridge loans for the downtown development? They've been sold," Henderson gasped, his hands trembling as he laid a stack of legal documents on the coffee table. "Sold? To whom? To Van Pelt? To Chase?" Sterling demanded, his voice cracking. "No," Henderson whispered. "To a holding company registered this morning called Lennox and 135th Partners. Julian, they didn't just buy the debt. They've moved to accelerate the repayment schedule. Under the bad character clause in your original contracts, they are demanding full repayment of $60 million by tomorrow morning." Sterling felt a cold, hollow sensation in his chest. He realized that Bumpy hadn't just attacked his bank account, he had hijacked the very mechanisms of his ownership. Bumpy Johnson was now, for all intents and purposes, Julian Sterling's landlord. The man he had called a servant 24 hours ago now held the deed to his home, his office, and his future. Sterling attempted one last, desperate gamble. He picked up his secret red phone, the line he used to reach the dark corners of the city's muscle. He called a high-ranking enforcer in the Italian mob, a man who had taken Sterling's donations for years. "I need Bumpy Johnson handled," Sterling hissed into the phone. "I'll pay triple. I want him gone tonight." The voice on the other end was silent for a long, agonizing moment. Then came the reply. "Julian, you don't get it. Bumpy didn't ask us to kill you. He asked us to let you live so you could see the bill. No one is taking your money, Julian. Your money is no good here anymore. Don't call this line again." The line went dead. Sterling looked at the phone as if it were a poisonous snake. He was a billionaire surrounded by millions of dollars worth of art and mahogany, yet he was utterly penniless in the only currency that mattered: loyalty. The debt trap had snapped shut, and the weight of the city was beginning to press down on him with the force of a tidal wave. By 5 p.m. on the second day, Julian Sterling realized that the financial and labor isolation was merely the overture to a much more terrifying symphony. The true nightmare began when the legal system, a machine he once believed he could manipulate with expensive dinners, campaign contributions, and private handshakes, turned its cold, mechanical teeth toward its former master. In the 1960s, the web of New York City's building codes, safety regulations, and zoning laws was a dense, administrative labyrinth. Usually, Sterling's money acted as a flashlight in that dark maze. Now, Bumpy Johnson had not only turned off the lights, but had also rewritten the walls. Bumpy didn't need to hire the high-priced, silk-stocking lawyers of Park Avenue who spent their afternoons at the Yale Club. Instead, he activated a ghost army of the invisible people he had quietly championed, protected, and funded for decades. These were the legal secretaries who filed the motions in the dead of night, the low-level clerks in the basement of City Hall who stamped the documents with a smirk, and most importantly, the black building and safety inspectors who had spent their entire careers being stepped over and insulted by men of Sterling's stature. To Sterling, these people were part of the architecture. To Bumpy, they were the keys to the kingdom. Within a frantic 3-hour window, a small army of city inspectors descended upon every single Sterling construction site across the 5 boroughs simultaneously. It was a coordinated strike of red tape. A fire inspector, a man whose mother's mortgage had been quietly settled by Bumpy years ago, declared the alarm systems in Sterling Plaza critically non-compliant, citing an obscure 1922 ordinance. Health inspectors suddenly found severe, irreparable sanitation violations in the waste management systems of Sterling's luxury hotels. Most devastatingly, the Department of Elevator Safety ordered the immediate physical sealing of every elevator cabin in his signature Park Avenue tower due to structural microfractures that only they seemed to see. Each violation was recorded with a terrifying, surgical precision. Every ticket was accompanied by a stop work order or an immediate vacate notice that was leaked to the press before Sterling's team could even read the fine print. Sterling realized, with a mounting sense of nauseating horror, that for every hour his project sat idle, he was losing nearly $50,000 in bank interest. Interest he no longer had the liquid capital to pay. He was being bled to death by 1,000 paper cuts, each one delivered by a hand he had never bothered to look at. The situation turned from dire to catastrophic when Sterling tried to call his primary law firm, Whitman and Associates, to launch a counter-offensive. He expected a room full of Ivy League pit bulls ready to tear these inspectors apart. Instead, the response was a chilling, professional silence. The senior partner, a man Sterling had considered a close friend for 20 years, spoke with a voice as cold as a tombstone. "Julian, we've reviewed the federal tax fraud allegations and the freeze on your primary accounts. Given that our retainer checks are currently bouncing and the SEC is breathing down our necks just for talking to you, the board has decided to suspend all representation to avoid a conflict of interest. We've couriered your files to the curb outside your building. Please don't call this office again." Sterling stood frozen in the middle of his office, the floor covered in a literal mountain of subpoenas and cease and desist orders. He was trapped in a legal swamp where every desperate move only pulled him deeper into the muck. His prestige had become a liability, and his political ties had evaporated like mist in a hurricane. Bumpy Johnson had successfully turned the white man's own rule of law into a tightening noose. Julian Sterling, the man who thought he owned the city, was discovering that the city was now owned by the man he had dared to humiliate. As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon of the Manhattan skyline on the second day, the Park Avenue penthouse, once a symbol of untouchable luxury, transformed into a gilded tomb. The power had been cut earlier that afternoon due to a clerical discrepancy with the utility company that no amount of shouting could fix. Julian Sterling was left to navigate his vast, silent rooms by the flickering, unsteady light of expensive scented candles. The silence was heavier than any roar of traffic. It was the silence of a man being erased. His stomach growled with a hollow, persistent ache. He was a billionaire with a refrigerator full of beluga caviar and wagyu beef, yet with no stove to cook on and no staff to serve him. He was as helpless as a child. In a state of raw, unadulterated desperation, Sterling decided he needed to bypass the frozen bank accounts. He needed the one thing that still talked in New York: hard currency. He moved to his wall safe, the one the IRS hadn't yet taped shut, and grabbed his velvet-lined jewelry box. Inside sat a platinum Patek Philippe, several high-clarity diamond cufflinks, and a rare emerald brooch intended for his mistress. He also snatched a small, rolled-up canvas from his study, a minor Matisse sketch he had bought at an auction for $300,000. He draped a common trench coat over his disheveled suit, hoping to look like just another anonymous soul, and slipped out through the service entrance. His destination was the Diamond District on 47th Street, where he knew several high-end pawnbrokers and off-the-books fences who thrived on anonymity. But as he stepped onto the sidewalk, Sterling felt the invisible wall Bumpy Johnson had built. The city felt different. The taxi drivers, mostly black and Puerto Rican men who usually competed for his tips, suddenly had off-duty signs illuminated the moment he raised his hand. He was forced to walk 20 blocks in shoes, never meant for the pavement of New York. He finally reached the shop of a man named Solly, a broker who had laundered Sterling's miscellaneous expenses for a decade. Sterling slammed the Matisse canvas onto the glass counter, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Solly, I need 50,000. Cash, now. Keep the change as a premium." Solly didn't even look at the painting. He didn't even pick up his loupe to examine the diamonds. He simply looked at Sterling with a mixture of fear and profound weariness. He pushed the box back across the counter with a trembling hand. "I can't do it, Julian. I like my shop. I like my windows without holes in them. Word came down from the hill this morning. Bumpy put a stay-away order on your name. Anyone who buys from you, anyone who gives you a dime, is declaring war on Harlem, and Harlem is a lot closer than the police right now." "I made you, Solly," Sterling hissed, his face contorting. "I'll have you shut down by morning." "By morning, you won't even own the chair you're sitting on," Solly replied, his voice a whisper of finality. "Go home, Julian, or what's left of it." Sterling stumbled back into the night, the jewelry box feeling like a lead weight. He tried to buy a simple ham sandwich at a 24-hour deli to quiet his cramping stomach. He held out $100 bill, the last bit of cash he had found in a coat pocket. The clerk, a young man with a cold, knowing stare, looked at the bill and then at Sterling's face. "Register is locked for you, mister. No bread, no water, no service." It was the ultimate, crushing humiliation. Julian Sterling, a man who once believed he moved the world, could not even buy a piece of rye bread. He sat on a cold stone bench in the shadows of Central Park, clutching his jewelry box like a common beggar. He looked up at the darkened silhouette of his own skyscraper and realized the true nature of Bumpy's revenge. It wasn't about the money. It was about the social death. Bumpy had stripped him of his humanity, turning him into a ghost haunting his own city. As the clock ticked toward the final 24 hours, Sterling realized that without his status, he was absolutely nothing. The 72 hours of hell had reached its psychological zenith. The king was dead, and he was the last one to find out. The third and final day of Julian Sterling's 72-hour sentence began not with the triumphant golden rays of a Manhattan sunrise, but with a grey, suffocating mist that rolled off the East River like a shroud, draping itself over the glass towers of Park Avenue. Inside his penthouse, the silence was no longer a luxury. It was a physical weight pressing against his eardrums until they throbbed. The apartment, once a temple of mid-century modern perfection, had transformed into a decaying monument to a dead god. The climate control systems had failed hours ago, leaving the air stale and heavy, carrying the faint, sickly sweet scent of rotting lilies in a crystal vase that no one had bothered to water. Julian Sterling sat on the cold, white marble floor of his master bedroom, his back against a bed that cost more than a family home in Harlem. He was clutching a bottle of lukewarm tap water, as if it were the last drop of life on earth, his hands trembling so violently that the plastic crinkled like a scream in the quiet room. Without the constant, reassuring hum of the air conditioning, the rhythmic chime of his stock tickers, and the deferential whispers of his staff, Sterling's mind began to fracture. He was experiencing the hallucination of power, the terrifying realization that everything he thought he owned was merely a shadow cast by the labor of others. He began to hear phantom sounds. He heard the sharp, insistent ringing of his private office line, but when he crawled to the desk, the receiver was as cold and dead as a stone. He heard the voices of his board members, men he had golfed with for decades, debating in hushed tones how quickly they could scrub his name from the brass plaques in the lobby. But the most haunting sound was the echo of his own voice at the boutique. He replayed the insult over and over, the sharp, ugly slurs he had hurled at Mayme Johnson. He realized now, with a nauseating clarity, that those words hadn't just been an outburst of ego. They had been his own death warrant. He had insulted the queen of a kingdom he didn't even realize he was living inside. He finally forced himself to stand, his legs feeling like lead, and stumbled toward the full-length vanity mirror. The man staring back was a grotesque parody of the Julian Sterling who had started this week. His 3-day beard was thick and grey. His silk shirt was stained with sweat and spilled gin, and his eyes were sunken pits of raw, unadulterated terror. He looked like a beggar who had stolen a billionaire's life. The realization finally shattered the last remnants of his ego. Sterling's power had never been internal. It was a suit of armor provided by a world that favored his skin and his bank account. Without the maids to iron his shirts, the drivers to navigate the streets, and the banks to validate his existence, he was less than a ghost. He was a zero. He crawled back to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. Looking north, toward Harlem, he saw the distant lights of the neighborhood flickering through the fog. To the rest of New York, it was a slum, but to Sterling, it now looked like the only place where life was actually happening. He understood, with a bone-chilling certainty, that he had exactly 12 hours left until the 72-hour mark. If he didn't reach Bumpy Johnson and offer his soul on a platter before that clock struck 0, he wouldn't just be ruined, he would be erased from the world entirely. With trembling fingers, he began to strip off his ruined finery, searching for the most humble, nondescript clothes in his wardrobe. He was preparing for a pilgrimage of the damned, a walk of absolute penance into the heart of the lion's den. The walk from Park Avenue to the heart of Harlem is only a few miles on a map, but for Julian Sterling, it felt like a journey across a jagged, unforgiving continent. He emerged from the service entrance of his building at 10 a.m., a shattered remnant of the man who had entered it 3 days prior. There was no doorman to hail him a cab. The sidewalk was empty of the usual deferential nods. He stood on the corner of 72nd Street, raising a trembling hand toward a yellow taxi, but the driver, a man whose cousin worked the numbers in Bumpy's territory, simply looked through him as if he were made of glass and sped away. Sterling was forced to do something he hadn't done since he was a child of the Depression. He began to walk. The transition was subtle at first, then jarring. As he crossed the invisible line of 96th Street, the architecture of the city began to change, but more importantly, the gaze of the city changed. On the Upper East Side, he was a ghost. Here, he was a specimen. By the time he reached the 110th Street border, the gateway to Harlem, his expensive leather shoes were scuffed and caked with city grime, and his lungs, accustomed to filtered penthouse air, burned from the exhaust and the unseasonable heat. He crossed the line into Bumpy's kingdom, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. The air here was thicker, filled with the smell of soul food, the screech of jazz from open windows, and the rhythmic thrum of a community that was very much alive. Everywhere he looked, Sterling saw the invisible empire he had dared to mock. The man sweeping the sidewalk in front of a barber shop stopped his work to watch him pass, his eyes cold and knowing. The group of children playing stickball in the street paused, their laughter dying down as they tracked the disheveled white man in the ruined suit. Sterling felt 1,000 eyes on him, a collective consciousness that knew exactly who he was and exactly what he had done. He wasn't just walking down a street. He was walking through a courtroom where the jury was every person he had ever looked down upon. The psychological weight was more exhausting than the physical trek. He realized that Bumpy hadn't just isolated him in his apartment. He had marked him. To the people of Harlem, Julian Sterling was a trophy of their king's justice. He saw a poster for a rally taped to a telephone pole, and underneath it, a hand-drawn note with his own name on it, crossed out in red ink. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every time a black sedan slowed down beside him, he flinched, expecting a bullet, but the cars only lingered for a moment, letting him see the occupants' calm, judgmental faces, before gliding away. As he turned onto 135th Street, heading toward the legendary 22 West Club, Sterling's resolve nearly failed him. He was a man who had sat in boardrooms with governors, yet he now felt like a peasant approaching the throne of a dark god. He saw the neon sign of the club flickering in the afternoon haze, and for a moment the irony nearly choked him. He had spent his life building towers to keep the world away, yet here he was, crawling through the dust to beg for a place inside the world he had despised. He reached the heavy brass doors of the club, his clothes damp with sweat and his pride reduced to ash, and realized that the hardest part of the 72 hours wasn't the loss of his money. It was the terrifying necessity of having to ask for his life from a man he had once refused to acknowledge as an equal. When Julian Sterling finally pushed through the heavy, brass-trimmed mahogany doors of the 22 West Club, the sudden shift in atmosphere hit him like a physical blow. Outside, Harlem was a riot of color, noise, and the chaotic energy of the 1960s. Inside, the club was a cathedral of clandestine power, governed by a silence so profound it felt choreographed. The air was cool and carried the expensive, intertwined scents of aged bourbon, high-grade Cuban tobacco, and the faint floral perfume of the elegant women who graced the lounge. It was a world of deep crimson velvet, polished dark wood, and gold accents, an opulence that rivaled any club on the Upper East Side, yet possessed a soul that Sterling's world could never replicate. Sterling stood in the foyer, a grotesque juxtaposition to his surroundings. He was drenched in sweat, his ruined suit jacket draped over one arm like a discarded skin, and his face was a mask of grime and desperation. He expected to be mocked, or perhaps immediately seized and beaten. Instead, he was met with something far more unnerving: absolute indifference. The patrons of the 22 West, men in sharp midnight blue suits and women in silk cocktail dresses, didn't gasp or point. They simply adjusted their gazes, looking through him as if he were a smudge on a window pane. To them, the great Julian Sterling was no longer a titan. He was merely a piece of debris washed up on their shore by the tide of Bumpy's will. He approached the long, curved bar where a man in a white tuxedo jacket was meticulously polishing a crystal snifter. I need to see Mr. Johnson," Sterling croaked, his voice cracking from hours of disuse and dehydration. The bartender didn't look up. He continued his work with a rhythmic, hypnotic grace. "Mr. Johnson is currently occupied with the business of the neighborhood," he replied, his voice a smooth baritone. "You can take a seat on the bench by the coat check. We'll let you know if he finds a gap in his schedule." Sterling looked at the hard, backless wooden bench. It was the kind of seat reserved for messengers and supplicants. For a fleeting second, the old Julian Sterling, the one who had fired board members for being 30 seconds late, flared up in his chest. He opened his mouth to roar about his status, his connections, his wealth. But then he saw two men standing near the back hallway. They weren't holding guns. They didn't need to. They stood with a relaxed, predatory stillness, their eyes tracking his every micro-expression. They were the fruit of Islam-style enforcers of Bumpy's inner circle, men who viewed Sterling not as a man, but as a problem to be solved. The fire in Sterling's chest died instantly, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. He walked to the bench and sat. He waited for 4 hours. During that time, he watched the lifeblood of Harlem flow through the club. He saw a grandmother come in to whisper a thank you to one of Bumpy's lieutenants for a fixed roof. He saw a young musician receive a handshake and a small envelope to fund a trip to a Paris conservatory. He saw the quiet, reverent way everyone spoke the name Bumpy. Sterling realized with a crushing weight that he had spent his life building a fortress of money, while Bumpy had built a fortress of people. As the 70th hour of his ordeal ticked by, the heavy door at the end of the hallway finally opened. A man in a sharp grey suit, Bumpy's right hand, stepped out and looked at the disheveled wreck on the bench. He didn't use Sterling's name. He didn't even use a title. He simply crooked a finger in a gesture that said, "Come." Sterling stood up, his knees buckling for a moment, and followed him into the darkness of the hallway. He was no longer a mogul entering a business meeting. He was a prisoner walking toward the gallows, praying for a miracle he knew he didn't deserve. The office at the back of the 22 West Club was a space defined by a heavy, airless stillness. As Julian Sterling stumbled inside, the door clicked shut behind him with a finality that sounded like a prison bolt. The room was bathed in the warm, amber glow of several shaded lamps, casting long, dramatic shadows against walls lined with leather-bound books and framed photographs of Harlem's jazz legends. In the center of this sanctuary sat Bumpy Johnson. He looked exactly as he had 3 days prior, immaculate, composed, and utterly terrifying in his calm. He was reading a newspaper, a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose, looking more like a retired professor than the most powerful man in Upper Manhattan. Sterling stood in the center of the Persian rug, his legs shaking so violently he had to lock his knees to keep from collapsing. He waited for Bumpy to look up, for the explosion of anger, for the death sentence. But Bumpy continued to read for a full minute, the only sound in the room being the soft rustle of the newsprint. Finally, Bumpy folded the paper with agonizing slowness and looked at the wreck of a man standing before him. "You look tired, Julian," Bumpy said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that seemed to vibrate in Sterling's very bones. "I'm told you walked all the way from Park Avenue. That's a long way for a man who hasn't touched the pavement in 20 years. Sterling's throat was so dry, it felt as if it were lined with sandpaper. "Please," he managed to croak, the word coming out as a pathetic wheeze. "Whatever you want. The buildings, the money, the accounts. I'll sign it all over. Just stop it. Make the phones ring again. Tell the banks I'm okay. I'll give you 50 million, 100 million, just let me have my life back. Bumpy sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment that cut Sterling deeper than any blade. He stood up, walking slowly around the desk until he was inches from Sterling's face. He smelled of expensive cedar wood and clean linen, a sharp contrast to Sterling's stench of sweat and failure. "You still don't understand, do you? You think this was a robbery? You think I spent 72 hours dismantling your life because I wanted your Project Olympus or your Matisse sketches?" Bumpy leaned in closer, his dark eyes reflecting Sterling's own terrified image. "I have more money than I can spend in 3 lifetimes, Julian. I own the streets you walk on and the air you breathe. I didn't do this to take your wealth. I did this to show you that your wealth is a lie." Sterling flinched as Bumpy reached out, not to strike him, but to gently straighten the ruined lapel of Sterling's jacket. "You came into my neighborhood, and you insulted my wife. You saw a black woman, and you thought you saw a servant. You thought your money made you a god and made her a ghost. So, I decided to turn the tables. I turned you into the ghost. I showed you what happens when the servants stop serving. I showed you that without the people you despise, you are just a shivering, hungry man who can't even buy a sandwich." Bumpy walked back to his desk and picked up a heavy, silver-plated fountain pen. "The 72 hours aren't quite up, Julian. You have 2 hours left, 2 hours of being nothing, 2 hours of being invisible." He looked at his watch, the tick-tock of the mechanism sounding like a heartbeat in the silence. "Money can't buy back what you lost in that boutique. Only one thing can. And it's going to cost you much more than $100 million. It's going to cost you the only thing you have left, your pride." The heavy, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of Bumpy's office sounded like the steady beat of a drum leading to an execution. As the minute hand jerked toward the final stroke of the 72nd hour, the door at the back of the room opened. Mayme Johnson walked in. She was draped in a shimmering midnight blue silk gown, her pearls glowing softly in the amber light. She looked like the very definition of dignity, a stark, blinding contrast to the ruined, filth-streaked carcass of a man sitting on the floor before her. Julian Sterling didn't just look up at her. He recoiled, the shame of his previous words burning hotter in his chest than the hunger in his stomach. Bumpy stood up and moved to his wife's side, his hand resting gently on her waist. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum that seemed to suck the air out of Sterling's lungs. "The clock is at 0, Julian," Bumpy said, his voice devoid of any triumph, carrying only the weight of a final judgment. "You asked me what it would cost to have your life back. You offered me money, buildings and stocks. But as I told you, those things have no value here. You tried to buy your way out of a debt of the soul." Bumpy leaned down, his eyes locking onto Sterling's sunken, watery gaze. "Here is the price. Tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. you will stand on the sidewalk in front of Sterling's on 5th Avenue, the very spot where you threw my wife and daughter into the street. You will not be wearing a suit. You will wear the same ruined rags you have on now. You will hold a sign, handwritten, that admits your cowardice and your ignorance. And in front of the press, in front of your peers, and in front of every servant you've ever looked down upon, you will get on your knees and you will beg Mayme Johnson for the privilege of breathing the same air as her." Sterling's mouth fell open, a silent protest dying in his throat. This wasn't just a financial ruin. It was a total social assassination. To perform such an act would be to commit suicide in the eyes of the Upper East Side elite. He would never be invited to another board meeting, another gala, or another club. He would be a laughingstock, a pariah, a man whose name would be synonymous with absolute humiliation for the rest of history. "And the buildings?" Sterling whispered, his voice trembling. "The Sterling building on Park Avenue?" Bumpy smiled, a cold, thin line. "I've already signed the preliminary papers. It's being renamed the Harlem Heritage Center. The top 5 floors will be low-income housing for the families of the men who built it. You will sign the final deed as you stand on that sidewalk. That is the price for the banks to start answering your calls again. That is the price for the elevators to move. That is the price of your breath." Mayme Johnson looked down at Sterling, her expression one of profound, quiet pity. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was the final proof that his world of white privilege was a fragile glass ornament that Bumpy had just shattered into a million pieces. Sterling realized he had no choice. If he refused, he would walk out of this club into a world where he was already dead. If he accepted, he would live. But he would live as a shadow of the man he once was. I'll do it," Sterling sobbed, his head dropping to his chest as he finally broke, his spirit collapsing entirely. The 72 hours of hell were over, but the eternity of his shame was just beginning. Bumpy nodded once to his men. The god of Park Avenue was led out of the room like a stray dog, leaving the king and queen of Harlem alone in the silence of their triumph. At exactly 10 a.m. the following morning, the gilded sidewalks of Fifth Avenue, the most expensive stretch of real estate in the Western world, witnessed a spectacle that would be whispered about in the boardrooms of Wall Street and the jazz clubs of Harlem for the next 50 years. Usually, this hour was reserved for the silent, graceful movements of socialites and the arrival of black-car chauffeured executives. But today, the air was electric with a different kind of energy. A crowd had gathered, a sea of faces that represented the true New York, white-gloved elites, curious tourists, and a massive contingent of Harlem residents who had traveled south to witness the return of the debt. Julian Sterling stood on the very spot where he had committed his original sin 3 days prior. He was a sight that defied the logic of Park Avenue. He was not wearing his $1,000 bespoke suit. He was dressed in the same sweat-stained, tattered rags he had worn for the last 48 hours. His hair was a matted mess, his face was gaunt, and he clutched a crudely fashioned cardboard sign with hands that shook like dry leaves in a storm. The sign, written in thick black ink, read, "I am a man of small character who failed to recognize a queen. I beg for the forgiveness of Mayme Johnson." The crowd fell into a hushed, reverent silence as a pristine black 1963 Cadillac Fleetwood pulled smoothly to the curb. The door was opened by an impeccably dressed driver, and Mayme Johnson stepped out. She was the vision of grace, wearing a tailored cream-colored suit and a matching hat, her pearls shimmering in the morning light. Bumpy Johnson followed her, his presence alone acting as a gravitational force that pulled every eye toward him. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at the man on the sidewalk. As Mayme reached the center of the sidewalk, Julian Sterling's legs finally gave out. Not from physical exhaustion, but from the sheer weight of his own public erasure. He dropped to his knees, the gravel of the sidewalk biting into his skin. Tears of pure, unadulterated shame carved streaks through the grime on his face. In front of the flashes of dozens of press cameras, orchestrated by Bumpy's media contacts, the god of Park Avenue looked up at Mayme Johnson and whispered the words that cost him his world. "Please, Mrs. Johnson, forgive me for my ignorance. I am nothing compared to you." Mayme looked down at him for a long, agonizing moment. She didn't gloat. She didn't scream. She simply gave a slow, dignified nod, a gesture of such immense moral superiority that it made Sterling seem even smaller than he already was. Bumpy then stepped forward, producing a single legal document and a silver fountain pen. Without a word, he placed the paper on the sidewalk in front of Sterling. This was the deed to the Park Avenue building, the crown jewel of Sterling's empire, being transferred to the Harlem Community Trust. Sterling signed it with a trembling hand, his signature a jagged scrawl of a man who was no longer sure he existed. As the final ink dried, Bumpy took the document, tucked it into his jacket, and helped Mayme back into the car. As the Cadillac pulled away, leaving Sterling kneeling in the middle of a crowd that was already beginning to laugh and point, the message was clear to every tycoon in New York. Money is a shield made of glass. Honor is a fortress made of steel. Julian Sterling's 72 hours of hell had ended, but his life as a member of the human race was over. He was a ghost on Fifth Avenue, a man who had been taught that the people he thought were invisible were the ones who actually held the keys to his soul. The ripples of Julian Sterling's public downfall did not fade with the morning headlines. They transformed into a tidal wave that reshaped the power dynamics of New York City. Within weeks, the Sterling name was stripped from buildings, replaced by names of civil rights icons and local heroes. The man himself vanished. Rumors suggested he had retreated to a secluded estate in Florida, living in a self-imposed exile, unable to look a servant in the eye for the rest of his natural life. He was the first billionaire in American history to be assassinated, not with a bullet, but with the cold, hard reality of his own insignificance. But in Harlem, the victory was celebrated not with chaos, but with a renewed sense of sovereignty. The Sterling building on Park Avenue, now the Harlem Heritage Center, became a living monument to Bumpy Johnson's philosophy. It wasn't just a piece of real estate, it was a sanctuary. The lower floors housed the finest jazz conservatory in the city, while the upper floors provided dignified housing for the very laborers, the elevator operators, the maids, and the construction workers, who had helped Bumpy bring a titan to his knees. It was the first time in the 20th century that the invisible border of 110th Street had moved south, reclaiming a piece of the city for the people who truly built it. Bumpy Johnson's reign continued for 5 more years, a period historians now call the Golden Age of Harlem autonomy. He became more than a godfather. He was a shadow statesman. He was the man who could sit with Malcolm X in the afternoon to discuss community defense and dine with Italian mob bosses in the evening to maintain the peace. He understood a truth that few in his position ever grasp. True power is not the ability to take life, but the ability to protect it. His 72 hours of hell campaign against Sterling became a required study for every street lieutenant and community leader. It proved that in the modern era, information, community loyalty, and psychological warfare were far more lethal than any Tommy gun. On July 7, 1968, the heart of Harlem stopped. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson passed away from a heart attack while eating a late-night meal at Wells Restaurant, the very place where he had held court for decades. His funeral was the largest in the history of the neighborhood. A sea of thousands that stretched for miles. They didn't just come to mourn a criminal, they came to honor a protector. As his casket, draped in white lilies, passed by the Lenox Avenue corners where he once stood guard, the city was silent. Even the NYPD officers, men who had spent years trying to put him behind bars, stood at a crisp salute. They knew they were witnessing the end of an era. The story of Bumpy Johnson and Julian Sterling remains the ultimate testament to the physics of respect. It serves as a reminder that the world is built on the backs of those we often choose not to see. Julian Sterling lived in a world of mirrors, seeing only his own reflection and his own wealth. Bumpy Johnson lived in a world of windows, seeing the needs, the pains, and the untapped power of his people. In the end, the man who built towers of glass was shattered, while the man who built a fortress of community became immortal. As the lights of Harlem flicker on each night, and the ghost of the 22 West Club echoes with the faint sound of a silver fountain pen signing a deed, the legend of the 72 hours of hell lives on. It is a story whispered to every new generation of dreamers and fighters. Never mistake a man's quietness for weakness, and never, ever mistake his wife's dignity for a target. Because in the kingdom of Harlem, the king may be gone, but his laws are written in the very stone of the streets.